The hospital room smelled like antiseptic, cold metal, and something far more poisonous than either of them. Betrayal had a scent of its own, and if it did, it lived in that room. Amani Sterling lay motionless beneath stiff white sheets, her face pale against the pillow, her body still enough to convince anyone that life had already abandoned it. Machines surrounded her like silent witnesses, their lights blinking in quiet rhythm, their soft mechanical sounds stitching together the illusion that medicine was still doing something meaningful. To the doctors, she was almost gone. To the paperwork waiting outside the room, she was practically a signature away from being erased. At her bedside stood her husband, Derek Mitchell. Entangled in his hand was another woman's hand, Rain Porter. Neither of them bothered to pretend grief for very long. They looked at the monitors, then at each other, and in that glance they said everything words had not yet caught up to. Relief, impatience, greed, freedom. The future, as far as they were concerned, had finally cleared itself of one inconvenient obstacle. Derek exhaled slowly, as if he had been carrying some heavy burden for years. Rain leaned closer to him, her manicured fingers brushing his wrist, her expression soft with satisfaction rather than sorrow. "So this is it?" she whispered. Derek nodded. "The doctor says there's almost no chance. They'll wait the required period, and then that's it." Rain's mouth curved. "And after that?" He looked at Amani's still body and said the words with horrifying calm. "After that, we move on." They spoke in low tones, but not low enough, not careful enough. They talked about insurance money, about shared accounts, about how much easier life would become without the woman in the bed, about a wedding somewhere beautiful, somewhere warm, somewhere far from the dreary apartment and the ordinary life Derek claimed he had outgrown. Rain talked about beaches and white linens and a honeymoon in the Maldives as though they were discussing weekend plans, not the death of a wife whose heart had not yet fully surrendered. They laughed softly, and beneath closed eyelids, something inside Amani stirred. Not her body, her mind. Because Amani Sterling was not dead. She was trapped, silent, buried under paralysis and darkness, but she was there, and she heard every word. For years, invisibility had defined her life in ways no one around her had ever understood. Every morning in the small apartment on the edge of downtown began the same way. Amani woke before dawn, careful and quiet, so the mattress would not shift enough to disturb Derek. She would stand in the dim blue light before sunrise, wrap a robe around herself, and step into the kitchen where the world still belonged to silence. She brewed coffee. She made breakfast. She checked the bills. She packed Derek's lunch when he wanted one, ironed his shirts when he had forgotten to, and arranged the day so smoothly that when he eventually woke, his life would already be waiting neatly in place. He rarely thanked her. Most days, he did not even look closely enough to realize how much she had done. By the time Derek wandered into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes and scrolling through his phone, the coffee would be ready, his tie already chosen, the apartment warm, the sink empty. The chaos of life held back by a woman he had long since stopped seeing. To the outside world, Amani Sterling looked ordinary. That was by design. She dressed in neutral colors. She wore simple flats, modest blouses, inexpensive coats. She spoke softly, never too much, never too loudly. At work, she appeared to be just another employee in a mid-sized financial consulting firm. One of those women people described with words like pleasant, dependable, forgettable. She answered emails. She carried folders. She listened more than she spoke. Her co-workers liked her well enough, but no one was intimidated by her. No one envied her. And no one imagined that behind those calm eyes existed a mind that could dismantle corporations before lunch. Derek, on the other hand, thought very highly of himself. He worked as a mid-level manager at Henderson Freight Solutions, a logistics company across town. It was a respectable position, though not nearly as prestigious as he liked to pretend. Yet Derek carried himself like a man on the verge of extraordinary success. He spoke about meetings as though he were shaping global commerce. He mentioned promotions before they happened, as though the universe naturally arranged itself in anticipation of his greatness. He often reminded Amani, in ways subtle and direct, how fortunate she was to be married to a man with a real career. Unlike her, he would say. Unlike your little desk job. Unlike your boring office life. He said it jokingly sometimes. Other times, not at all. What Derek never knew, what no one in his circle knew, was that Amani's boring office life was a fiction carefully built brick by brick. The firm where she worked was not merely affiliated with Sterling Empire. It was one of its many subsidiaries, a quiet branch in an enormous web of acquisitions, holdings, partnerships, and controlled interests stretching across finance, transport, media, real estate, and emerging technology. Sterling Empire was worth billions, and Amani Sterling did not simply work there. She owned it. She was the sole heir to the empire her mother had built. Majority shareholder, final authority. The invisible hand above every boardroom, every vote, every strategic pivot. Publicly, her presence in the company was almost mythical. She had refused interviews. She had declined magazine covers. She had never cultivated celebrity. Most outsiders knew the name Sterling, but few knew the face of the woman who controlled it. That anonymity had not happened by accident. 3 years earlier, before Derek, before the apartment, before the disguise of ordinary life, Amani had lived in a very different world. Her mother, Eleanor Sterling, had built Sterling Empire from almost nothing. Born into scarcity and disrespect, Eleanor had climbed through industries that had no intention of making room for a woman like her. She had fought racism, sexism, sabotage, financial drought, and predatory men who smiled while trying to rob her blind. She did not merely survive the business world, she conquered it. By the time cancer finally laid claim to her body, Eleanor Sterling had become a legend in private financial circles, a woman whose signature could move markets and whose absence from a deal could collapse it. When she died, she left everything to her only daughter. Amani was young, brilliant, grieving, and entirely unprepared for what wealth did to people. The loneliness came first. Then the performances. Her college boyfriend, a man who had spoken for years about soul connections and shared futures, proposed to her with tears in his eyes within weeks of Eleanor's funeral. For one fragile moment, standing in the wreckage of loss, Amani wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that love had remained untouched by the revelation of her inheritance. Then she discovered him selling confidential company material to a competitor. He had not loved her. He had loved access. After that came friends, old classmates, former mentors, distant relatives with emotional stories and urgent needs. Everyone had an idea, an investment, a problem, a reason she should trust them, save them, partner with them, lend to them, rescue them. Smiles sharpened into hooks. Sympathy turned transactional. The more she gave, the more people reached. No one asked how she was coping with the loss of her mother, unless it led naturally into a request. No one wanted Amani. They wanted Sterling. So she made a decision that her board considered absurd. She stepped back from public life, installed trusted executives for day-to-day operations, maintained final authority through encrypted channels, private reviews, and tightly controlled legal structures, and then disappeared from her own myth. She rented a modest apartment, took a low-level role inside one of her own companies, wore cheaper clothes, drove an unremarkable car, reduced herself, on purpose, to someone no one would hunt. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she only wanted one thing: to know whether love could find her if wealth did not enter the room first. Then she met Derek. They met in a coffee shop on a rainy Tuesday evening when she was working late and pretending not to. He was charming in the effortless way mediocre men often are when they have learned the surface tricks of attention. He remembered details from their first conversation. He made her laugh. He held eye contact. He told her she had kind eyes, and, unlike others, he did not seem impressed by what he assumed she lacked. When she spoke about wanting a simple life, he said he respected that. When she admitted she was not ambitious in the flashy sense, he smiled and said peace mattered more than status. At the time, it sounded like understanding. Now, looking back, it was probably calculation, so instinctive he barely knew he was doing it. Still, in the beginning, he was warm, attentive, curious. He called when he said he would. He showed up with coffee. He listened. He seemed to admire the very qualities the world overlooked in her. With Derek, Amani allowed herself the dangerous luxury of hope. They married within a year, and she kept her secret. Not forever, she told herself. Just until she was sure. Just until she knew his love could survive the truth instead of being born from it. She wanted the revelation to feel like trust, not bait. But the right moment never came. Because slowly, subtly, Derek changed. The tenderness thinned first, then the patience, then the respect. He came home later and later. There were new colognes on his clothes, perfumes that did not belong to her. His phone became a second skin, always face down, always locked, always lighting up with messages that earned small, hidden smiles. He began to criticize everything: her cooking, her hair, her clothes, the way she talked, the way she breathed, it seemed sometimes. He spoke to her as though she were an obligation he regretted, a decision that had failed to yield enough return. Amani told herself it was stress. She told herself marriages went through seasons. She told herself the man she met was still in there somewhere. The truth was uglier. The truth had already moved in and begun making itself comfortable. The night her life split open began quietly. Amani sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, reviewing a crisis report from Sterling Empire. A hostile takeover attempt aimed at one of their commercial subsidiaries had been brewing for weeks, and she had been running strategy through encrypted channels deep into the night, sleeping in fragments, eating badly, carrying more than her exhausted body wanted to admit. The apartment was dark, except for the blue glow of the screen. Numbers blurred. Legal projections swam. Her shoulders ached. She pressed 2 fingers to the space between her eyes and forced herself to read one more page, then another. She had survived worse than exhaustion. She had negotiated through grief. She had rebuilt bleeding divisions while mourning a mother who had been both parent and compass. She could get through one more night. Then pain struck behind her eyes like something sharp had been driven there. Her hands slipped from the keyboard. A strange weakness rolled through her limbs. She stood too fast, or tried to, and the room swayed hard enough to tilt reality. The edges of the kitchen darkened. Her legs stopped belonging to her. She opened her mouth to call for help, but only the faintest breath escaped. Then the floor rose up, and the world vanished. Derek found her later, face down on cold tile. For a moment, all he felt was annoyance. The expression crossed his face before concern arrived. And if anyone had been there to see it, they would have witnessed the truth of him in its purest form. Then he called emergency services. His voice was controlled, inconvenienced, almost irritated, as though his evening had been interrupted by bad weather rather than his wife's collapse. At the hospital, he answered questions with a husband's title and a stranger's knowledge. Did she have any known heart issues? He did not know. Was she on medication? He did not know. Emergency contacts? No idea. Family history? Nothing useful. The doctors worked through the night. Severe exhaustion, cardiac complications, cerebral hypoxia, too little oxygen to the brain for too long. By morning, the outlook was bleak. Amani had fallen into a deep coma. Brain activity was minimal, prognosis poor, recovery unlikely. Derek received the news with a steadiness that would have looked like courage to people who did not know the difference between composure and relief. He thanked the doctor, walked into the hallway, pulled out his phone. "Rain," he said quietly. "You should come to the hospital. She's not going to make it." Rain arrived quickly. She was beautiful in the polished, deliberate way some women become when ambition has been refined into style. Sharp eyes, expensive perfume, perfect posture. She had been Derek's mistress for over a year, a co-worker adjacent to his professional life, impatient with secrecy, tired of excuses, certain she deserved more. When she walked into Amani's room, she did not even try to fake tears. "So this is her," Rain said, studying the woman in the bed. "She looks smaller than I imagined." Derek stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "The doctor says there's no hope. We just have to wait." Rain folded her arms. "And then we're free." They talked openly because cruelty often mistakes silence for certainty. They assumed the woman in the bed was already gone. They discussed what would happen after. Insurance, accounts, travel, a new apartment, a wedding. Rain laughed about how simple it all was in the end. Derek said something about dead weight finally removing itself. Inside the prison of her body, Amani heard them. Every word entered her like broken glass. She tried to move. Nothing. She tried to scream. Nothing. Her body had become an abandoned house with the lights still on somewhere deep inside. She could hear, feel, think, remember, but she could not command so much as a finger. At first came disbelief, then pain, then something colder, a clarity hard enough to cut through grief. Because in that darkness, with her husband planning a future over her dying body, Amani stopped being only a betrayed wife. She began becoming herself again, not the version that made breakfast in silence and swallowed disappointment like medicine. Not the version that hoped softness would be enough. This was the woman who had inherited an empire before 30 and kept it alive in rooms full of older men who expected her to fail. This was Eleanor Sterling's daughter. And Derek Mitchell had made the fatal mistake of thinking quiet meant powerless. Time inside paralysis became strange. The first hours passed not in sequence, but in waves of sound and sensation. The beep of machines marked something, though she could not say what. Nurses entered and left. Shoes squeaked softly on polished floors. Paper rustled. Voices rose and faded. Names were spoken. Charts were updated. Somewhere outside, life went on with obscene normalcy. Then Derek and Rain came back. They brought food. They ate beside her bed. Rain cracked open a soda. Derek spoke with his mouth half full. They discussed the insurance company as if they were reviewing a utility bill. $500,000, he said. Rain sounded pleased. That was more than she expected. They began assigning purpose to money Amani had not even died for yet. A condo, travel, furniture, a fresh start. Derek mocked his wife's face, her voice, her pathetic little life. He said she had given him nothing, that the worst part was she truly believed he loved her. If Amani could have cried, she would have drowned. Instead, she listened and memorized. By the next day, Derek's family arrived. His mother, Patricia Mitchell, entered like she owned grief and intended to spend it cheaply. She was one of those women who mistook hardness for wisdom and cruelty for honesty. Patricia had disliked Amani from the beginning, though dislike was too simple a word. She had dismissed her, measured her, found her lacking. Not glamorous enough, not wealthy enough, she assumed. Not useful enough for the son Patricia believed deserved better than the life he had built. Brittany, Derek's younger sister, followed with the restless eyes of someone who had always been more interested in what things cost than what they meant. They barely looked at the bed before centering Derek, as if he were the true victim of the room. "My poor boy," Patricia murmured, embracing him dramatically. Then, with one glance toward Amani, "I always said she was too weak for you." Brittany drifted toward the table where Amani's personal effects had been placed. Purse, phone, small jewelry, lip balm. She picked through them shamelessly. "Does she have anything valuable?" Brittany asked. "Nothing much," Derek replied. "She never had money for anything decent." Patricia sniffed as if that settled a moral question. Then what was the point of her? They discussed funeral costs next. Minimal flowers, no unnecessary spending, no large service, no obituary in the papers. Why waste money on a woman who had given them nothing? Rain sat in the corner, composed and quietly satisfied, already comfortable enough to occupy space in the family's orbit. Derek glanced at her when Patricia was not looking. Their future had already begun to take shape in the shadows of his wife's bed. Amani heard that too. And within the cage of her silence, something unforgiving took root. She began reviewing her own memories the way a strategist reviews battlefield errors. Every time Derek had come home late, every criticism she had excused, every night she had lain awake wondering why tenderness had dried up between them, every instinct she had softened for the sake of preserving peace. She saw, all at once, how thoroughly she had betrayed herself in order to keep believing in him. The realization hurt, but it also freed her. She stopped trying to force tears through a body that would not answer. She stopped begging inwardly for the old life back. She concentrated instead on one thing: survival. The unexpected turning point arrived in the form of a physician with tired eyes and a good memory. Dr. William Harrison had been called in to review her case before the final recommendation was made. He was in his late 50s, silver beginning to claim his temples, the kind of doctor whose gentleness had been earned rather than performed. He had seen too much suffering to romanticize medicine, too much death to approach it carelessly. He read her chart with methodical focus. Then he examined her. Vital signs, reflexes, pupillary response. When he lifted her left arm, his gaze caught on a small, crescent-shaped birthmark beneath her wrist. He went still. It was a tiny thing, easy to miss, the sort of feature no casual observer would ever remember. But Harrison remembered. 10 years earlier, Eleanor Sterling had been his patient during the worst stretch of her cancer treatment. Fierce, even in pain, sharp even when medication tried to soften her edges, Eleanor had spoken often of her daughter. Not with sentimental excess, but with fierce pride. She had shown him photographs once. In one of them, mother and daughter stood side by side, both with the same small crescent mark. "If anything ever happens to her," Eleanor had said, in one of those late-night conversations illness sometimes invites, "promise me you'll look after her." He had made the promise, knowing, or believing, he would never be called to honor it. Now he looked from the birthmark to the patient's chart. Name: Amani Mitchell by marriage. Age, height, weight. Something clicked. He excused himself from the room and went straight to his office. A secure search later, his suspicion hardened into certainty. Amani Sterling. Age, 32. Sole heir and controlling authority of Sterling Empire. A woman rarely photographed, almost never seen publicly, so absent from the visible world that many assumed she was little more than a symbolic figure, while others ran her company for her. But Harrison knew. And if he was right about who she was, then the situation was far more dangerous than the hospital understood. He made a call. The legal department at Sterling Empire answered on the second ring. "Marcus Reynolds speaking." "This is Dr. William Harrison from Metropolitan General Hospital," he said. "I believe I have Amani Sterling in my intensive care unit." Silence. Not confusion. Shock. Then Marcus Reynolds spoke, his voice suddenly stripped down to steel. "Tell me everything." Harrison did. The coma, the prognosis, the husband, the impending termination of life support. At the mention of paperwork, Marcus cut in. "The husband has no authority," he said. "Amani executed a living will 2 years ago. I am her designated healthcare proxy. He cannot authorize anything." Harrison frowned. "There's no such document in her current file." "There should have been, but she compartmentalized her personal life aggressively. I'm leaving now. Do not let anyone touch her care plan until I arrive. Do you understand?" "I do." And Harrison meant it. For the first time since Amani collapsed, someone in that building understood the scale of what lay in that bed. Not the wealth, not the status, the person. As the hours crawled forward, Derek grew impatient. He cornered residents in the hallway, complained about delays, mentioned bills, repeated phrases like "brain dead" and "no point prolonging this," as though rehearsing them enough might transform greed into compassion. Patricia supported him loudly. She invoked rights, marriage, family authority. Brittany hovered nearby with the expression of someone irritated by inconvenience. Rain became bolder. One afternoon, when Derek had stepped out and a nurse was occupied down the hall, she approached Amani's bed and leaned close enough for her breath to touch Amani's ear. "Can you hear me?" Rain whispered. Then she laughed softly at her own question. "Probably not. But just in case, I want you to know something. Derek never loved you. He told me that the first night we were together. He said you were convenient, temporary, just someone to fill the space until someone better came along." Rain straightened slightly, savoring the words. "And now I'm here." Amani listened without breaking. The woman Rain believed she was tormenting, the quiet wife, the naive placeholder, was already burning away. In that room, under fluorescent lights and institutional air, a rebirth was taking place, with no witnesses and no ceremony. The part of Amani that still begged to be chosen was dying. What remained would not beg again. The final hours before Derek expected total victory arrived heavy with false certainty. He stood near the foot of the bed with a pen in hand, his mother beside him, his sister near the window, Rain not far away, already dressed for the celebration she imagined would follow. The attending physician entered reluctantly, the paperwork present but delayed. Before Derek could press for completion, the door opened. A man in a black suit stepped in, with the controlled force of someone who did not need to raise his voice to seize a room. Behind him came 2 lawyers and a security officer wearing the insignia of Sterling Empire. "Stop," the man said. Everyone did. Derek turned sharply. "Who are you?" The man laid a folder on the nearest surface and opened it with deliberate calm. "My name is Marcus Reynolds. I am legal counsel and designated healthcare proxy for Amani Sterling, Chief Executive Officer and majority shareholder of Sterling Empire. According to her legally executed directives, all medical decisions regarding her care fall under my authority, not yours." The room went silent in a way silence rarely happens, complete, stunned, airless. Derek blinked. "Sterling?" Marcus met his eyes. "Yes." Patricia's face emptied. Brittany dropped the magazine in her lap. Rain physically stepped back. Marcus continued with the clean precision of a blade. "Your wife controls assets valued in the billions. She also took legal measures to ensure that, in the event of incapacitation, no spouse could interfere in her care or estate. You have no authority here, Mr. Mitchell. None." Derek looked at the woman in the bed as if seeing her for the first time. The plain clothes, the simple apartment, the quiet job. The wife he had treated like disposable background. All of it rearranged itself in his mind into something impossible. He whispered, almost to himself, "She had nothing." Dr. Harrison stepped forward then, unable to hide his contempt. "She had everything. You simply never cared enough to notice." Inside her stillness, Amani heard the collapse. Not of a body, of an illusion. And somewhere deep inside the darkness, she almost smiled. Marcus Reynolds moved quickly. Within hours, Amani's hospital room ceased being a vulnerable space and became a fortified one. Sterling security took position outside the door. Legal files began to accumulate. Calls were placed to corporate headquarters, external counsel, internal investigators, and private crisis teams. Derek and his family were removed from the room and confined to a waiting area under supervision. Rain attempted to disappear and was politely informed that leaving would be unwise. Power had shifted. Completely. Derek paced the hallway in disbelief. His mind looped helplessly around the revelation. His wife owned the empire. His job, Henderson Freight, was a subsidiary under Sterling control. The promotions he boasted about, the salary increases he wore like medals, the self-importance he had used to demean her, Marcus soon informed him that much of it had been facilitated quietly because he was married to Amani Sterling. Special consideration. Corporate note. Spouse of senior stakeholder. Derek stared like a man being stripped in public. He had not climbed. He had been carried. Even Rain's career sat inside the wider Sterling ecosystem. The marketing firm she worked for managed campaigns for Sterling-linked companies. She, too, had built her betrayal under the roof of the woman she betrayed. The irony was so exquisite, it almost felt engineered. Patricia demanded explanations. Brittany cried. Rain insisted she had not known. Marcus listened to none of it with interest, because all of them had made the same mistake. They thought value only counted if it announced itself. Amani had never announced herself. And now, they were standing in the wreckage of underestimating her. The morning she opened her eyes, there was no dramatic music, no cinematic miracle, no theatrical gasp. Just a flutter. A shift. Then her eyes opened slowly to the pale light of the room. A nurse saw it first. Dr. Harrison arrived moments later, relief crossing his face with rare honesty. "Welcome back, Miss Sterling," he said quietly. Amani stared at the ceiling for a moment, then at the machines, then at Marcus standing near the window, then at the security officer by the door. Her throat burned when she tried to speak, but she forced the words out. "I heard everything." Marcus stepped closer, concern briefly overtaking professionalism. "You need rest." "No." She swallowed against the dryness and pain. "I want to see him." Derek was brought in. He entered like a man walking toward judgment, shoulders slack, face hollowed by shock and sleeplessness. When he saw her sitting upright, alive, conscious, looking directly at him, something desperate broke loose in his expression. He rushed forward and dropped to his knees beside the bed. "Amani, thank God. I was terrified. I thought I'd lost you." She looked at him for a long moment. No tears, no tenderness, only recognition. "You were terrified?" she asked softly. "Is that what you call it?" He reached for her hand. She did not move hers toward him. "You're my wife," he said. "I love you." The word love hung between them like something rotten. Amani repeated it once, almost curiously. "Love." Derek nodded too eagerly. "Yes, of course. Whatever you heard, whatever was said, I was in shock. I was grieving. I didn't mean any of it." She held his gaze with terrifying calm. "Did you mean it when you told Rain I was boring? Pathetic? A burden? Did you mean it when you discussed insurance money over my body? Did you mean it when you counted down the hours until you could sign away my life?" His face crumpled. "I can explain." "You don't need to." Her voice did not rise. That made it worse. "I heard you, all of you. Your mistress, your mother, your sister. Every word." Derek began to cry then, the way weak men cry when consequences finally introduce themselves. "If I had known—" She cut him off. "Yes," she said. "That is exactly the problem." He froze. Amani leaned back slightly against the pillows, her strength not fully returned, but her authority unmistakable. "If you had known who I was, you would have treated me better." He said nothing, because there was nothing to say. She turned her head toward Marcus. "Execute Protocol Omega." Marcus gave a short nod and stepped out to begin the machinery.
Derek stared upward from his knees as though the floor had vanished beneath him. "What does that mean?" he whispered. Amani looked at him one final time with the kind of pity reserved for people who destroy themselves through smallness. "It means," she said, "that I'm done being merciful." Consequences moved faster than grief ever had. Derek Mitchell was terminated from Henderson Freight Solutions, effective immediately, for violations of ethics policy and conduct standards. Access to shared financial accounts was frozen pending review. Divorce proceedings were initiated under the protection of a prenuptial agreement Derek had signed without reading, certain that a woman like Amani had nothing worth protecting. The document ensured that every meaningful asset remained entirely outside his reach. Then came the criminal exposure. Questions were raised regarding his attempts to push for life support termination despite lacking legal authority. Hospital conversations were reviewed. Witness statements were gathered. Counsel prepared. The matter was no longer private marital tragedy. It was potential criminal misconduct. Rain Porter discovered the next morning that her access badge no longer worked. Her termination letters cited conflict of interest, professional misconduct, and violations of corporate ethics. That alone would have been devastating. But Sterling Empire's influence stretched wider than most outsiders understood. Quiet calls were made. Quiet warnings were shared. No dramatic blacklist was announced, but the effect was the same. Interviews vanished. Recruiters stopped calling. Her name became something decision-makers preferred not to touch. Patricia and Brittany received visits from investigators seeking statements about their presence, their comments, and their possible role in pressuring medical staff. Their confidence evaporated under legal light. The family that had spoken about Amani as though she were already gone now spoke only through attorneys. Meanwhile, Amani recovered. Slowly.
The body always takes longer than rage wants it to. There were physical therapy sessions, medication schedules, neurological tests, carefully monitored rest. Dr. Harrison visited often, not only as a physician honoring an old promise, but as someone quietly proud of the woman who had returned from the edge with her mind sharpened rather than shattered. Marcus kept the outside world contained. Board members were informed selectively. Press inquiries multiplied. Rumors exploded through financial circles and gossip media alike. The mysterious Sterling heir had been discovered in a coma under another name. The husband had allegedly betrayed her. The details were too cinematic not to spread. Amani said nothing publicly. Silence, when chosen, was still one of the most powerful rooms she knew how to stand in. 2 weeks after collapsing in her kitchen, she walked out of Metropolitan General Hospital on her own feet. Not quickly, not without effort, but under her own power. A convoy of black vehicles waited at the curb. Security formed a discreet barrier as cameras flashed from behind press lines. Reporters shouted questions into the air. "Miss Sterling, is it true your husband tried to remove life support? Will you make a public statement? Are criminal charges being considered? Why did you hide your identity for 3 years?" Amani did not answer. Marcus opened the rear door of the lead SUV. She stepped inside. Across the street, Derek stood on the sidewalk. Wrinkled shirt, hollow cheeks, eyes bloodshot. He looked older than he had any right to look, as if the truth had reached inside him and accelerated decay. This was the man who once mocked her for being ordinary, who rolled his eyes at her quietness, who believed her life had no scale. Now he stood in public, watching her leave, surrounded by power he had never recognized. For a brief moment, through tinted glass, their eyes met. Derek's face flickered with hope, regret, disbelief, pleading. Amani looked away. That was all. Inside the vehicle, Marcus settled into the seat opposite her. "The board wants a full briefing tomorrow," he said. "The press will keep escalating. They want to know if you intend to return publicly." She watched the city move past the window in long gray strips of light and traffic. "There's also the question," Marcus added carefully, "of whether you regret hiding who you were." For a long moment, she did not answer. 3 years. 3 years spent shrinking herself to be loved honestly. 3 years spent calling self-erasure an experiment in hope. 3 years spent mistaking endurance for wisdom. Did she regret it? She considered the apartment, the breakfasts, the cruel remarks, the nights waiting up, the way she had tried and tried to be enough without ever realizing she had started from a place of abundance no one had deserved access to. Finally, she said, "I regret trusting the wrong person." Marcus remained silent. "But I don't regret wanting something real," she continued. "I had to know." "And now?" Amani leaned back and closed her eyes, not from weakness this time, but from a strange and hard-earned peace. "Now," she said, "I rebuild. On my terms." Returning to Sterling Empire was not a single event. It was a reclamation. The headquarters rose above the city in glass and steel, all symmetry and confidence. Executives who had served loyally in her absence gathered in boardrooms with carefully controlled expressions. Some looked relieved, some curious, a few wary. They had worked under her direction for years without daily physical access to her. Now the invisible authority had entered the room in person. Amani took her seat at the head of the board table and said very little at first. She listened to updates on acquisitions, exposure risks, media narratives, pending litigation, and internal morale. Listened to strategies proposed in polished language by men who once questioned whether anyone so young could inherit Eleanor Sterling's legacy without drowning in it. She let them speak long enough to reveal their assumptions, then began answering. One by one. Calmly. Precisely. By the time the meeting ended, no one in that room had any doubt left about who was in command. Her return had not weakened the company. It had clarified it. She initiated a full ethics review across Sterling subsidiaries, not because she needed symbolic revenge, but because betrayal had shown her where complacency lived. Quiet corruption thrives in cultures where people think no one is looking. She had spent too long living unseen. Now she would see everything. The internal review uncovered more than anyone expected. Misuse of discretion, favoritism, poor reporting chains, informal networks of compromise. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to offend her deeply. She removed people, reassigned authority, rebuilt protocols, strengthened legal firewalls around executive privacy, tightened personal risk procedures. What happened to her would never happen the same way again. Not to her, and not to anyone under her protection. Publicly, when she finally made a statement, it was brief. No tears, no theatrics, no revenge speech. She confirmed that a medical crisis had occurred, that she was recovering well, and that Sterling Empire would continue operations without disruption. She thanked the medical professionals who had acted with integrity. She refused to discuss her marriage in detail. Personal legal matters, she said, would proceed through the proper channels. The statement was so controlled it drove the press insane. But among those who understood power, it had the intended effect. She had not returned as a victim. She had returned as authority. Derek, meanwhile, discovered what life felt like when borrowed importance was stripped away. The calls stopped first. Co-workers who used to flatter him no longer answered messages. Friends who enjoyed his confidence found excuses to disappear. Landlords cared about rent, not heartbreak. Lawyers cared about retainers, not tears. Rain would not speak to him. Patricia alternated between blaming him and blaming Amani, though both strategies were equally useless. Brittany kept asking whether prison was a real possibility. For the first time in his life, Derek had to sit in rooms where his last name, his charm, and his assumptions about what he deserved carried no weight at all. He requested a meeting with Amani. She declined. He wrote letters. They were forwarded to legal. He tried apologies in every tone he could manufacture. Broken, reflective, romantic, spiritual, self-pitying. None of them reached her. Marcus saw to that. Because apologies, Amani understood now, are often just another form of hunger. Derek did not want forgiveness because he had found goodness. He wanted relief, escape, restoration. He wanted the consequences reduced to something survivable. But some lessons only arrive fully when nothing cushions the fall. Rain left the city within months. No one could confirm where she went. Patricia retreated into bitterness so total it became almost religious. Brittany found herself learning, very late in life, that proximity to someone else's perceived power is not the same thing as possessing any of your own. Amani did not follow any of it closely. She was busy, not with revenge, with construction. That was always the deeper difference between people like Derek and people like Eleanor Sterling's daughter. Some destroy to feel tall. Others build because they already are. In the months that followed, Amani changed in ways even those closest to her had not expected. She did not become colder exactly. She became clearer. She moved out of the apartment and never returned except through representatives. She took up residence in a penthouse she had technically owned for years but never occupied. She restored relationships with a handful of people who had proven loyal even when they believed she had chosen distance over intimacy. She visited Eleanor's grave more often, spoke to her sometimes in the privacy of dusk. Not because she believed the dead answered in words, but because motherhood leaves echoes in the women it shapes. Dr. Harrison received a handwritten note and a private donation to a neurological recovery fund at the hospital. He understood the meaning of both. Marcus remained what he had always been: loyal, exacting, unshakable. Yet after the crisis, something subtle shifted between them. Not romance, not dependence. Trust, perhaps, deepened by ordeal. The kind forged when one person arrives in the final hour and says, with absolute certainty, no farther. For the first time in years, Amani began allowing herself to be fully visible in selective ways. Not socially, not carelessly, but truthfully. She appeared at shareholder meetings, gave strategic interviews, spoke at a Women in Finance summit where young executives expected polished slogans and instead received a talk about discernment, boundaries, and the cost of making yourself smaller so others will feel safe beside you. The speech went viral. People quoted one line more than the others. Privacy is wisdom. Self-erasure is surrender. I learned the difference too late, but not too late to survive it. That line followed her for months. Perhaps because so many people understood it immediately. Perhaps because invisibility is a wound more common than anyone admits. Late one evening, long after the scandal had cooled into case files and memory, Amani stood alone at the windows of her office overlooking the city. Below her, traffic flowed in ribbons of red and white. The skyline glittered. Somewhere out there were hospitals, cheap apartments, coffee shops, office buildings, men making promises they did not mean, women shrinking themselves to fit inside those promises. She thought about the woman she had once been, the one who believed love would come if she hid all evidence of her power. The one who cooked breakfast at dawn for a man who never noticed she was holding an empire together before he had even brushed his teeth. The one who lay in a hospital bed, unable to move, while betrayal dripped into her ears. That woman was gone. Not erased, transformed. There are deaths that happen without funerals. There are rebirths no one applauds because they happen in silence, in private decisions, in the cold interior of finally seeing clearly. Amani had died once already, not medically, but spiritually, in the marriage where she kept offering devotion to a void. She would not die that way again. Her phone buzzed softly on the desk behind her. Another update, another meeting request, another corner of the empire asking for its queen. She turned from the glass, walked back into the light of her office, and kept building. Because Derek Mitchell had mistaken her quiet for emptiness. Rain Porter had mistaken her stillness for defeat. Patricia and Brittany had mistaken humility for worthlessness. They all thought they were watching the end of a woman. What they had actually witnessed was the moment she remembered who she had always been. Amani Sterling was not saved by wealth. Not really. She was saved by truth. By the brutal, clarifying truth of hearing exactly what people say when they think you are powerless and cannot answer back. That truth cost her a marriage, illusions, years she would never reclaim. But it gave her something more valuable than the fantasy she had been chasing. It gave her back herself. And once a woman like that returns to herself, the world does not get to decide her value anymore. It only learns to live with it. A year later, on the anniversary of the day she collapsed, Sterling Empire launched the Eleanor Foundation for Women in Recovery and Reinvention. Officially, it funded medical support, legal aid, emergency housing, and career rebuilding for women emerging from betrayal, coercive relationships, or financial dependency. Unofficially, it was Amani's declaration that pain would not be the final use of what she had survived. At the launch event, cameras flashed, and donors smiled, and journalists prepared their polished questions. When Amani stepped to the podium, the room quieted instantly. She wore black, not in mourning, but in authority. Her voice carried without strain. A great many people, she began, believe survival is the end of the story. It is not. Survival is the threshold. What comes after matters just as much. What you build after betrayal. What you reclaim after being underestimated. What you become after the people closest to you reveal that they never truly saw you. No one moved. No one interrupted. My mother taught me that power is not the absence of suffering. It is the refusal to let suffering write your final definition. She paused then, just long enough for the weight of the words to settle. I stand here today not because I was protected from cruelty, but because cruelty failed to finish me. The applause that followed rose like weather. Not because she had been wronged, because she had transcended being reduced to that wrong. Afterward, people would call the speech inspiring, iconic, unforgettable. Amani thought of hospital lights, of Derek's voice, of rain whispering poison near her ear, of the machine beeps in the darkness. And she thought, no, unforgettable is not the speech. Unforgettable is the moment you hear exactly who someone is and survive the sound of it. That night, after the gala ended and the city dimmed into midnight, Amani returned home alone, by choice, not by loneliness. There was a difference now, a profound one. She removed her earrings, stood barefoot on polished floors, and walked out onto the terrace where the wind touched her face with cool honesty. Above her, the sky stretched clear and endless. Below, the city kept moving, oblivious and magnificent. Her phone lit once with a message from Marcus, confirming that the foundation's opening had exceeded all projections. She smiled faintly and set the phone aside. Once, she had prayed to be loved for who she was. Now she understood a deeper prayer had been answered instead. She had learned who she was without needing anyone else to confirm it. And in the end, that was worth more than the marriage, more than the performance of devotion, more than the fantasy of being chosen by someone incapable of recognizing treasure unless it announced its price. She had been invisible only because she chose to dim herself. Never again. The city lights shimmered in the distance like a field of stars dropped to earth. Amani Sterling stood in their glow, unhidden, undefeated, and entirely her own. And somewhere in the vast and quiet chambers of her memory, the hospital room finally lost its power. Not because she forgot it, but because it no longer defined the ending. It was only the place where the wrong people revealed themselves, and where the right woman returned. Amani Sterling had once lain still while others planned her ending. Now she was the author of everything that came next.